Thank you for downloading this Council on Foreign Relations video. CFR is an independent national membership organization and nonpartisan research center. For more information, please visit us online at cfr.org.
Well, welcome everybody. I see we have another full house for this session of Foreign Affairs Live. We've been doing this now for 2 years, and we have gotten terrific audiences and very good questions from them, and you're going to get your chance to ask some this evening. When we get to that stage, wait for the microphone, give us your name and your affiliation, and one question per customer. When we're all through here, which will be about 7 o'clock, we're having a reception, and I hope you'll all stay for that. It's kind of fun. And you get a chance to ask the questions that you felt you didn't get to ask in the time allotted here. What do we do in these sessions? We invite authors of recent pieces in foreign affairs to come and explain them some more and to let you, as I say, query them. We've had Zbigniew Brzezinski here to talk about the Carter first-year foreign policy and the future of NATO. We've had Ian Bremmer, who talked about the rise of state capitalism. We've had Jim Dobbins talking about the Afghan-Pakistan situation. And we've had Martin Indyk, who talked about the ever-present Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what's going on. And also Roger Altman, who did a terrific job on explaining, it wasn't all that pleasant, I'll tell you, but explaining the Great Recession and the impact that's going to have on American foreign policy and position in the world. Before we get to the night, I want to take just a second to talk about the special issue that we have coming up. It's our November-December issue, which will be out before long, the latter part of October. It's a double issue, and it's themed. We don't do that very often, but it's themed to the world ahead. That's the sort of the big block headline on the cover for the issue. We have a number of pieces that try to look beyond just the immediate future, this year, early next year, and deal with some of the biggest issues that are coming at us for the next decade or so. Hillary Clinton has a piece on some rather substantial changes in America's approach to diplomacy. It's called the New Diplomacy. We have Arne Duncan, who is the Education Secretary, who's talking about the increased importance of education to being competitive in this world of globalization, and the fact that at the moment there is a gap between where we need to be, the United States, in terms of our education processes and what it's going to take to stay competitive with China, with India, with Europe, and so on. We've also got Eric Schmidt of Google, who's got a terrific piece on the really profound change that all the new technology is bringing to culture, not just here, but around the world, and how that's going to impact state-to-state relations. There are also a number of articles on some intriguing topics, the resurgence of religions and the impact of that on foreign policy, on some rather dramatic demographic changes that are coming and how that's going to affect us all. And then a number of pieces, because this is Foreign Affairs magazine, on changes in American power in the 21st century, and differing analyses, if you will, some of them reasonably optimistic and some of them not so much so. But tonight our topic is Mexico, with a special focus on the drug cartels. And our speakers are, to my immediate left, Robert Bonner, who was administrator of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration from 1990 to 1993. His essay, which was in the July-August issue, was entitled "The New Cocaine Cowboys: How to Defeat Mexico's Drug Cartels." So we're both going to get into what the cartels really are, and we're going to get into what can be done about it. And then there's Jorge Castañeda on my far left. Jorge was foreign minister of Mexico from 2000 to 2003. He remains very active in Mexican public affairs and academic affairs, but also over here. He is a professor at NYU, a political science professor, with special attention to Latin American issues. He has written innumerable articles and books, and a number of them for Foreign Affairs. His most recent one, which was in the September-October issue, was called Not Ready for Prime Time. And it's about that tier of emerging nations called the BRICS. Brazil would be an example, and how fast they are rising to sort of global status. But Jorge asked some very penetrating questions. Are they quite ready yet, despite their growth, to be playing an intelligent and sophisticated role as a leader at the top level of global affairs? Well, with that, let's get to it. And I'm going to ask Rob to start us off with kind of a status report, because there are a lot of different pictures you can get on the drug situation in Mexico, how pervasive it is, how violent it is, how much it's affecting the rest of things in Mexico, the state of their politics, the state of their economy. So I think it would be good to hear it from a pro who's been at this for quite some time. Exactly what is the drug cartel problem? What are the dimensions of it? What are the death rates and so forth? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better?
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Yeah, I think it is important to understand what we're dealing with, and the central point, I would say, is that the Mexican drug cartels, or what we refer to as the drug cartels in Mexico, have grown over the past 10, 15, 20 years so powerful that they threaten the institutions of the Mexican state. And when I use state here, I mean the État. And that is to say, through corruption and through intimidation, they're able to, in essence, control the legitimate institutions of the Mexican government, political, law enforcement, judicial, to a large or certainly an unacceptable degree. And so well, I guess starting at about December of 2006, shortly after the election of President Calderon, he began a campaign to essentially attack with the objective of defeating, that is to say, destroying these powerful drug cartels. By the way, there aren't that many of them. There are 5 or 6, depending on how you count them, and they're really not cartels. What they are large, multinational criminal organizations. A lot of their profits are derived from essentially the production or selling or distribution of illegal drugs, cocaine and methamphetamine in particular. To a lesser extent, they derive profits from sales of marijuana and so on. But they're also engaged in a whole host of crimes that organized crime groups tend to be involved in, which include extortion of legitimate businesses, shakedowns basically. They certainly include kidnappings for ransom.
Now, this kind of diversification happened in Colombia during their great drug period too, wasn't it?
No doubt about it. Yeah. Colombia, and that's the sort of the thrust of my article, is to take us back 15 or 20 years ago, where Colombia was facing a threat, a very similar threat, from the 2 of the largest and most powerful criminal organizations the world had ever seen. They were called the Medellin and the Cali cartels. And within a space of 6 or 7 years, with a lot of assistance from the United States and support from the United States, the Colombian government succeeded in destroying and breaking up these 2 large cartels. So I argue in my foreign affairs piece that if Colombia could do this, I'm very confident that Mexico can as well. If, by the way, and this is the big if it and the United States understand and apply the lessons learned from what the Colombians were able to do 15 or 20 years ago in terms of breaking apart and eliminating the cartels there.
Jorge, you've addressed this problem as well as many others, and you cited at least as one option something called a tacit deal between the government and the drug cartels. You want to explain that and how much of an option you think that might be?
Well,
and why we should consider it?
Rob quotes me in his excellent piece to that effect. I'm not sure that's the central part of my argument, or the argument I and several others have been making in Mexico the last couple of years, more or less, as a result of what I consider, I'll speak for myself, the failed war, President Calderon's failed war. It's not a failed state, on that we agree completely. I do believe it's an absolutely failed war, a war which has now cost 29,000 lives in 4 years, roughly $40 billion over and above what we used to spend on security.
You put it in the past tense, so you don't see it getting any better.
Oh, no, it's getting worse. I don't think there's any question that it's getting better. One can argue whether this is a necessary cost to pay in order for it to get better, and one can argue that the current disaster is a product of the government's success in containing or destroying the cartels. But that everyday violence in Mexico today is much worse than it was 4 years ago.
Just for the record, so the audience
I think
understands
is not arguable.
what we're talking about. What would be a tacit deal?
Well, as I said, that's not the central part of my argument.
I understand.
Let me come back. I'll get to that in just a second. The 2 points I try to make is, one, the cost of this policy is too great for Mexico, and the benefits are too small. Secondly, this war is not being won. It is a failed war. Thirdly, the alternative. Firstly, I think, and many of us think, magazine Nexos is coming out next week or this week with a major editorial and whole issue devoted to this, calling for the legalization of drugs in Mexico.
I was going to ask about that too.
President Fox has said so. President Cedillo has said so. Carlos Fuentes has said so. Our only living Nobel Prize winner, Mario Molina, has said so. Our biggest male actor star, Gael Garcia, has said so. A lot of people. I don't know what Salma thinks. I'd like to ask her, but I sort of think that's not going to happen. But anyway, first is legalization, at least of marijuana, especially if Proposition 19 wins in California 3 weeks from now.
Well, I was going to ask, how much difference does it make whether we decide to synchronize legalization along with Mexico?
I would like Mexico to be able to do this with the United States. But I'd like to quote President Santos of Colombia, his speech at the UN last week on this issue. And he's asking this question rhetorically, but I think he's making the same point we're making. He asks, I see the contradiction between, with some countries on the one hand demanding a frontal struggle against drug trafficking, and on the other hand legalizing consumption or studying the possibility of legalizing production and commerce of certain drugs. How can someone tell a peasant from my country that he will be persecuted and punished for planting plants or coca leaf for the production of drugs if in other parts of the world this becomes a legal activity? This is President Santos of Colombia, whose credentials I think are impeccable on this matter, asking the question that we in Mexico asked more directly because California is on our border, not on Colombia's border, and we're the big marijuana producers. The Colombians do the cocaine, we do the marijuana. This is International Division of Labor. Works okay. The question fundamentally, and here I'll address the tacit deal thing, Jim. I don't think that we should negotiate, or we can negotiate with the cartels, although it doesn't scandalize me. Gaviria negotiated with Pablo Escobar before he was killed and when he was put in La Catedral. I think you were DEA administrator at the time, and I don't recall that the U.S. government put up any major public objections to the deal that was struck with him. It didn't work. That's a different issue. But when the deal was struck, at least to the best of my recollection,
I can assure you behind the scenes there were a lot of objections.
I imagine so, but if they're not public, the United States did not feel strongly enough, and this was, if I remember correctly, with a Republican president, strongly enough to go public and say this is inadmissible. But I don't think that's what we should do. What I think we should do, the Mexican government should attack the collateral damage that today is what is really victimizing Mexican society. Extortion, kidnappings, robberies, etc. I'm not sure, I don't deny it, but I'm not sure. And I don't think the Mexican government has proof, or the American government has proof, that all of these are activities, which are really what affect citizens in Mexico, are being carried out by the drug cartels. As a matter of fact, I would even ask the question the other way around. If our success in combating the drug cartels is leading them to now begin to become kidnappers, shouldn't we just let them do their drug business and not kidnap people?
Well, I'm going to ask Rob. Look, I think we can get a little debate going here. Rob's piece takes a really rather different approach, which is that Colombia, which looked so dire 10 years ago or so, produced some successes, and that there are lessons to be learned from that that could be applied in Mexico. Rob.
You know, there's a few things to respond to here. First of all is the whole notion as to whether or not President Calderon's campaign has failed. I mean, after all, the cartels, the drug cartels in Mexico that we're talking about, have evolved and become this powerful over a period of actually a couple of decades. So it might take it more than a year or two actually to destroy them and defeat them. But there are some signs of success with respect to what's happening in Mexico. I mean, first of all, the Calderon government, as part of this campaign, has taken down some very, very high-level traffickers, including some kingpins and key lieutenants of some of these major Mexican drug cartels. They include, by the way, Arturo Beltran Leyva, who was killed in December of last year in Cuernavaca. But they also include more recently this guy named La Barbie and another guy.
Let me ask you to make a slight detour on this. Kingpin strategy was present in Colombia, and it seemed to be an important ingredient. Explain it a bit.
Yeah, it really was. It was essentially the notion was more than just taking out kingpins, by the way. It was identifying all the vulnerabilities of major multinational drug trafficking organizations, transnational organizations, which the Medellin and Cali cartels were at the time, including their cash flow, the availability of being able to repatriate their profits back to them, obviously exploiting their communications vulnerabilities, and ultimately weakening these organizations to the point that the government was able then to capture and incapacitate through extradition, by the way, or otherwise the leaders and the key players, the important members of these organizations. And when you do remove them, by the way, these organizations do fall apart, and that's what happened with both the Colombian cartels, Medellin and Cali. Now the point here is that if you went back in time to 1991, 1992, people were saying the same thing in Colombia, that these efforts against the Medellin and Cali cartels had failed. How can the government possibly destroy these incredibly powerful and corruptive and intimidating organizations? By the way, actually the problem in Colombia truly was worse than it is in Mexico today, and I don't mean to diminish what Jorge is saying about the drug-related homicides in Mexico, but the problem in Colombia was worse, both in terms of homicides, in terms of kidnappings, and about every other measure you might want to go into. We didn't even have a word for narco-terrorism before the Medellin cartel blew up buildings in downtown Bogota, took down a commercial airplane, and so forth. So in any event, there were hundreds of Colombian judges that were killed, thousands of police, journalists, by the way, and we see that problem with the cartels in Mexico, that they're taking on and they kill journalists if they print something that they disagree with, to the point that the major newspaper in Juarez just recently published a huge editorial saying, censor us, tell us what you want us to print, to the cartels. Now talk about democracy being under threat. It's under threat in Mexico. In any event, there was a strategy that was pursued in Colombia with U.S. support that worked, and those cartels that were powerful, that threatened the institutions of the Colombian state, are gone. Now, the other thing is, and there is some success. By the way, I don't want to say that the tide has turned. I don't know. But because you often don't know when you're in the midst of a struggle such as going on in Mexico. But I do know that you are seeing successes in terms of taking out major players in the Mexican drug cartels now in the last year or two. You've seen, by the way, record seizures of illegal drugs and weapons that are taking place. So there are some signs of some progress here. Legalization. Jorge raised this, and I've read what he said about that. here's the problem with legalization. First of all, if you just legalize marijuana, and that's what we're talking about, I'm from California, but there's a proposition called Proposition 19. If you, and maybe, by the way, there's some arguments as to legalization of marijuana. You can argue it one way or the other. I think the policy arguments preponderate against it myself, but nonetheless, if you just legalize marijuana, you're not going to put the cartels out of business. I can assure you in Mexico. I mean, first of all, the high profit margins from drugs are from methamphetamine and cocaine, not from marijuana. And secondly, these are polydrug, polycrime organizations, the cartels in Mexico, and they'll just move to market. You know, if marijuana became legal in the United States, if somehow that happened, they're just going to increase their marketing of other drugs, or they're going to increase their profits by engaging in other kinds of organized crime activity. So you really haven't solved anything there. And I think that, and it's one of these dead-end streets to me, because there are policy reasons why I don't think the United States is going to legalize cocaine and methamphetamine, the high-profit drugs of the Mexican cartels. I mean, I just don't think we're going to do that. As a practical, just sort of political reality, I think everybody in this room, well, I don't know, most people know that that is not going to happen.
Well, my students
that is not going to happen. And yet we get into this sort of finger-pointing exercise that we used to have from time to time with Mexico, which really gets neither the U.S. or Mexico anywhere here. So I don't see legalization as a viable option to reducing and defeating the cartels. And I think that the idea, and with all due respect to Jorge, you know, I was reading an article that he had written for fairly recently, I think last May, in which he does advocate pretty strongly. He says, first, Mexico needs to go back to the modus vivendi that government and the cartels had over the past 50 years. So you are arguing for it, and I actually think every country that has attempted to enter into some sort of a pact, Faustian pact with organized crime, has found it's untenable. I mean, first of all, I mean, you end up having the leaders of these organizations that are above and beyond the law. They can't. That's part of the deal you have to enter into when you enter into a Pax Mafiosa.
A chance here to answer, but he's a pretty good historian, and so what's your answer?
Well, I'm not sure that a tacit understanding and a modus vivendi is necessarily the same thing. A tacit understanding, or any understanding, implies a certain amount of agency, and a modus vivendi is something that just sort of happens. Not unlike, for example, if I know there are people I'm sure here who know much better than I do, but not terribly unlike what the Bush and Obama administrations have been doing with the poppy growers in Afghanistan and the Taliban. If I understand correctly, that perhaps could be referred to as a modus vivendi. My impression is that the 130,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan are not out eradicating poppy fields.
Well, they're
I
not
think
there.
They have other fish to fry.
And they're not there to eradicate
exactly.
poppy fields either. I mean, there's
well,
a different issue. So
we could consider that a modus vivendi.
Well, the question is, you know, the real question is
what's
the
Afghani
government, the Afghani government, which is highly dysfunctional. Could it actually do anything about chieftains in the provinces that are growing poppy? And the reality is, look, I don't think the analogy is very good. Mexico has reasonably good institutions that have been corrupted or are intimidated by major and powerful drug cartels. To even suggest that that this is remotely analogous to
well, I think what's analogous is not the reality. What's analogous is the modus vivendi. My impression is that the 130,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan have a modus vivendi with the poppy growers and the Taliban because they have a higher priority. There is something that is more important to them than eradicating poppy fields in Afghanistan.
Let me move it on a bit.
But let me move on because I think I want to insist on this issue that there is a difference between a tacit understanding and a modus vivendi, firstly. Secondly, I find it difficult to truly acknowledge that the kingpin strategy works, in Mexico at least. Because if you look, and you mentioned some of them in your piece very intelligently, if you look at the kingpins that Salinas, Cedillo, and Fox threw in jail and or extradited, these are far more powerful and significant kingpins than the guys these guys have gotten, who are at the end of the day, as of today, still second-tier people. They haven't gotten Chapo Guzman, they haven't gotten Mayo Zambada, they haven't gotten Vicente Carrillo, they haven't gotten any of those guys. Cedillo got Chapo and threw him in jail. He then escaped, but he threw him in jail. He got Garcia Abrego and he extradited or deported him here. Fox got the Arellano brothers and Ociel Cárdenas, and Salinas got the ones you mentioned. So, and this was long before any of this. So kingpin strategy in Mexico, I'm not so sure of. But let me come back to the legalization.
I don't think you really understood what I said about what the kingpin strategy is.
That it makes the collapse curtain.
It's not just removing kingpins. It is actually weakening the organizations by attacking their vulnerability.
That's my point. The other former presidents got the kingpins and didn't weaken them. So I'm not sure that getting kingpins by the way of a lower level than the previous three presidents is going to weaken them much more than what they did. But let me come back to the legalization.
Quickly, I want to raise another subject here.
Well, but this is your successor, one of your successors, John Walters, who I quote in a Washington Post piece, has said very recently that 60% of the Mexican cartel's profits come from marijuana. I have no way of knowing if that is true. But I don't imagine he would be saying it if it were not. And ONDCP said the same thing a couple of weeks ago, the current White House and its people. It sounds reasonable to me, not because I disagree with you. You're absolutely right that yes, but cocaine and methamphetamines are not totally in the hands of the Mexicans, whereas marijuana is totally in the hands of the Mexicans because we grow it, we produce it, we package it, we ship it, and then we even sell it. And that's why so much of the profits, according to the DEA, come from marijuana. So legalizing marijuana is not something insignificant if it were to happen.
Let's bring the United States into this discussion. We are culpable in a number of ways. We can also be helpful in some ways, as I think we were in Colombia. And the double-pronged question, the culpabilities, what are they at this stage? And are we improving at all in terms of doing some of the things that might actually help Mexico deal with this problem?
Well, I think, I think our government, including Secretary Clinton and the President Obama, have recognized that there's a shared responsibility that the United States has, and for a number of reasons. One, we are the major market. We're not the only market. There's pretty significant and increasing drug consumption in Mexico, Brazil, and other places. By the way, the Mexican drug cartels market to Brazil, and I might also say, as a digression, but methamphetamine, they produce the methamphetamine and they sell it, the Mexican drug cartels. It's not somebody else that's producing it. They're producing it. But in any event, so you have, we also have a situation where, as President Calderon and others have pointed out, a lot of the weaponry, particularly assault weapons that are getting into Mexico that are being used against Mexican law enforcement and the Mexican military, are coming from the United States. So we have a responsibility, and I believe we're moving out and doing a better job of enforcing laws that make it more difficult to buy and then smuggle, essentially, assault weapons. I'm talking about AR-15s and AK-47s into Mexico. So we have a responsibility there. And we are ratcheting up our efforts to interdict the outbound flow of drug cash that's generated through the sales of methamphetamine and cocaine in the United States back to Mexico into the hands of the cartels. All of that is part of a broader strategy, which is the kingpin strategy, which is attacking various vulnerabilities, including the fact that these organizations need cash in order to carry out their corrupt activities and their ability to fight back and intimidate the government. So it's not going to happen overnight. That's why I'm not quite as willing and ready as Jorge is to say that this has failed. I mean, this is going to take a sustained effort by the Mexican government with a lot of intelligent, astute support of the United States that is respectful of Mexican sovereignty.
One last question, then I want to turn to the audience. And this moves us a little bit beyond the drug question itself, although it's involved. Jorge, you've written about the 2012 elections, when the presidential election will be up again, arguing that it really needs to be used as a time for a great debate on a host of reform needs, because politically Mexico is in a state of disenchantment, if you will. Public participation in elections has been down with each presidential election in modern times. Most public opinion polls show a rather strong disillusionment by the public. What are some of your ideas, and how much is, and there's an economic component of this too. Mexico has a very sluggish growth rate at the moment, far below the regional average. How much is the drug problem contributing to disenchantment with the politics of Mexico and with the economic activity in Mexico?
Well, I think, Jim, very quickly that the two things do tend to go together.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are some economic activities in Mexico which are especially sensitive to the drug war. For example, tourism is one of them. This is not exactly the kind of place you want to go and spend your vacations at, unless you want to see a shootout. And we're working on it to organize them in Cancun and Ciudad Juarez and stuff. But otherwise, this is not the sort of thing that attracts tourism a great deal. It doesn't attract foreign investment a great deal either. No. This is not great for foreign investment. So we have to factor that part in, and I'll come to your point in a second, into the costs of all of this. It's not a year or two, Rob, as you know, it's now 4 years. Now, maybe 4 years is not enough. And maybe 8 years is not enough, maybe 10 is not enough. The question is, when do the costs of this war outweigh the benefits? Just to touch on the question of the cash. I see the logic of trying to stop money from entering Mexico and being available to the cartels. Now, which is the most effective and least costly way of doing that for Mexico? Stopping $20 billion from entering the country, which even the Swiss don't do. I mean, they've been living off dirty money for 500 years, and they haven't done a damn thing to stop it. You want us to really do it? You think this is doable? But let's suppose it is. Is that the most cost-effective way of doing it, or is legalizing as much as we can and all of a sudden making it a less profitable activity? But with that question, let me touch on what Jim asked me so we can then throw this out to the floor. Mexico needs to have a series of political reforms before anything else. We're incapable of making decisions. We can't. Let's do something as simple as Proposition 19, if California passes. Maybe we should have a Proposition 19 in Mexico. Well, we can't. Why can't we? Because the figure of the referendum does not exist in Mexico. It's the only democracy in the world, with the exception of the United States at a federal level, that doesn't have one. Everybody else decides major fundamental issues, constitutional amendments, international treaties, through a referendum. In Mexico, we can't do that. We can't re-elect our congressmen or senators. We can't have a runoff election in Mexico for the presidency, and the way things are going, the next president of Mexico will be elected probably with around 32% of the vote. Cedillo got 50, Fox got 43, Calderon got 35, next guy 32 if he's lucky, or she's lucky. We can't have we can't have independent or write-in candidates, which I tried to be. You can say that's a good thing, that I wasn't allowed to run, maybe. But nonetheless, we can't do it. Either somebody else can't do it. So we have to do these political reforms first, because only then can we carry out the so-called economic structural reforms on energy, on labor, international affairs, etc., which the country needs. But we know now that we can't do those reforms, tax reform, without changing the institutions first. We tried it. Cedillo tried it. An enlightened technocrat, unable to. Fox tried it. A great campaigner and a great educator and a lousy politician. He couldn't do it. Calderon tried. Great politician, not very charismatic, to put it mildly. He can't do it. It's not the guys. It's the institutions. They don't work. And they don't work for very good reason, because these institutions were crafted for the old authoritarian regime that we had for 70 years. You turn that into a democracy almost overnight. You try to use the same institutions, they don't work. logically enough. Why couldn't, who cares if you couldn't re-elect congressmen before? You weren't even electing them, let alone re-electing them. They were appointed by the president. So why do you want to bother with re-electing them? Who cares? They were appointed, as the governors were, as the senators were. So I think, in conclusion, a little bit, and I think the two things go together. We will not grow if we don't get ourselves the institutions that we need to make decisions. And once we get those institutions, among the tough decisions we'll have to make are the ones that you and I are discussing. But the problem today is that we're not having this debate in Mexico. We're not having a debate on legalization. We're not having a real debate on the costs and benefits of the war. We're not having a debate on the human rights issues that Jim and I are so involved in and interested in. And you know, you're very familiar with the letter that Human Rights Watch, that Ken sent President Calderon just last week, which is a very strong letter, a very critical letter. So you know, these are real issues we have to talk about in Mexico, and we're not having the national conversation on them that we should have. I hope that this sort of discussion contributes. I'm sure that pieces like yours contributed, and I hope that we can continue contributing to this Mexican national conversation.
Rob, go ahead.
Just one quick addition to that. But it seems to me, in thinking about the future of Mexico, that it's very difficult to think that Mexico is ever going to achieve its potential politically and economically until it ultimately deals with and crushes the drug cartels. And in doing that, I've argued that what's going to be necessary ultimately, and this is what takes time, is the reform of the law enforcement, police, judicial institutions of Mexico, and perhaps political and tax reform too would help. But in any event, it is not going to happen until, at least it's not going to reach its potential until this happens. And so that's why I think President Calderon understands that. How well the Mexican public does, and whether there'll be the ultimate political will, particularly after President Calderon leaves office, as he will at the end of 2012, to carry this forward, are, I think, profound questions for the future of Mexico.
Okay, I hope you can keep your questions concise, and we can then get in as many as possible. Our mic bearers are terribly swift, so wait for them to come after I've signaled who is going to be anointed. Yes, right in the middle here.
Thank you very much. I'm Emre. I'm with the Bar Globalization and International Affairs Program. My question is this. So, on the idea of legalization, is it possible to legalize in the sense that you create a system in which the incentives for the cartels to invest in a business which is legal are more than the profits that they're making currently? So in other words, they're engaged in illegal activities because they make a lot of money from it. But if a legalization process is created in which there are more incentives for them to engage in legal activities and make more money, wouldn't that work? Is it possible for it to occur?
You know, I think one of the observations I make about organized crime almost everywhere in the world, including the crime families that were here in New York City, is that if you give them a choice between doing something illegally and doing something legally to make money, they will always go for the illegal option. Now, why that is, I don't know. We perhaps need a
save on taxes.
We need this Serrano's psychiatrist or something. But that's the case. I mean, I just don't. I don't think that you're going to, through modus vivendi or any other process, you're going to get organized crime, criminal organizations, to think that they would be better off engaging in, let's say, a legitimate business.
Well, the only real precedent we have two actually. We have the case of Portugal with drugs since 2001, and they have actually, consumption has spiked and then dropped, and violence has diminished enormously. But we have another very, I think, useful example, if it's not a direct analogy either, but it's not totally invalid, which is, of course, the repeal of the Volstead Act at the end of Prohibition in the United States in 1933. Given, yes, the guys who had been the runners and contrabandists and all these people, they became legitimate alcohol producers and dealers, particularly the Canadians. if I recall correctly. I hope there's no Canadians around, but my impression, if I recall correctly, that's the origin of the Seagram's fortune, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, we're reading different history, because I can tell you what happened with U.S. organized crime, and that is they ultimately got involved in heroin production and transportation and sale and other illegal drugs and all sorts of other rackets, basically. I couldn't give you one instance of somebody that came out of, let's say, the organized crime groups in America that were smuggling alcohol into the United States that became legitimate businessmen. In any event, they tend to be by inclination more interested in engaging in criminal activity than.
I have problems. I have problems with the innate essence of certain people as opposed to others. But as you say,
Joseph Kennedy did come to mind. Actually,
the best way to figure that one out is, I think, with a psychiatrist. I think.
Okay. Do we have any psychiatrists handy who can help us? Any more questions? Yes, sir. Right here.
Hello, Cullen Shar with Jefferies Capital Partners, but also a native of South Texas. So, pressing issue. We talked about the political will in Mexico to propagate this war post-Calderon. But could you also briefly touch on the American administration's appetite to propagate this war in perhaps a more overt fashion, much like Colombia?
Well, look, I think what we're doing now, we've never had better collaboration with the Mexican government, at least on an issue, let's say, of this type, which is the drug cartels, and perhaps on any issue in history. It's unprecedented, so there's a lot of cooperation. But I think it's misguided to think that you would treat the problem in Mexico as some sort of problem where the U.S. would engage in some sort of operational action in Mexico. I mean, we didn't do that in Colombia with respect to the cartels. I was commenting to Jim that I guess a week or two ago, Secretary Clinton actually at the council was making parallels with between Mexico and Colombia.
Very mistaken, like you were in your piece.
I think rightly making parallels, but then suggested that the situation in Mexico was akin to an insurgency, which of course it isn't. And it leads you to, I think, some fuzzy thinking, because if you think there's an insurgency, see, the Colombians had two problems. Unlike Mexico, they had powerful drug cartels, and they had an insurgency. Mexico just has the powerful drug cartels. The problem is simpler. But an insurgency, by the way, is solved through military force. I'm not saying U.S. military force. It was Colombian military force. But Plan Colombia was about building up the military strength and using military force to suppress an insurgency, which is the FARC, the ELN, and the like. Dealing with cartels, organized crime, does not lend itself to a military solution. I mean, as a stopgap measure, President Calderon had to use the military because
how long do you think that should be?
Well, until you can build sufficiently credible and reliable institutions, as you are in Mexico. For example, the federal police under the SSP, there are now a fair number of vetted units as to which the U.S., I'm talking about U.S. law enforcement, can hand off actionable intelligence, and it's actually executed on. By that I mean, in a non-corrupt fashion, things happen. People get captured. So how long does it take? Well, it takes a while. All of the Colombians, by the way, they built up the Colombian National Police. They had the same issues, by the way. They had huge corruption issues in the Colombian National Police, but they built in anti-corruption best practices into their units, and they were able to do this. So how long does it take? I would say if you did everything right, it would probably take 4 or 5 years to actually defeat all of the cartels in Mexico, all 5 or 6 of them, and destroy them. So it's not going to happen overnight.
Let me address some of those points. I think they're really the fundamental ones. The first point is that There's a lot of fussing around with the numbers on this. And if you talk both with the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, with your colleagues in Washington, and with the Mexicans, everyone gives you a different number of how many federal police have actually been trained, how many have graduated from the San Luis Potosi Academy. If you just had the head of the police fire 3,000, that is 10%, because they were all corrupt, in a force of 30,000, which is in fact not a force of 30,000, but of around 19,000, well, I'm not sure we're making all that much progress. That's on the police issue.
I see that as actually positive in progress,
well,
and that is weeding
remember,
out,
we dissolved,
weeding out corrupt cops.
We dissolved the entire federal police directorate under De La Madrid 25 years ago. So this has been done in Mexico before. It's not that new. There's a lot of all of this, which a lot of people in the United States and which the Mexican government very rightly wants to present as new. But if you actually go back in time and in history, you will see that a lot of the things that they are flaunting as new have happened before many, many times. Let me address the question of Colombia, which you pointed out, on which we agree completely. These are two totally different stories. What Colombia has been remarkably successful at doing is dismantling the FARC, the ELN, and the paramilitaries, which I think also have to be mentioned. We don't have paramilitaries in Mexico, and we don't have a guerrilla in Mexico. I think the Colombians, by any definition, have been, and they themselves would agree with this, have been less successful in terms of acreage under cultivation, in terms of yields per acre under cultivation, in terms of the expansion of the areas of cultivation, now even to the shores in Nariño, which, by the way, if it is possible now to grow coca leaf at sea level in Nariño, then it's possible to grow coca leaf at sea level in Oaxaca and in Guerrero and in Michoacán. And this is something which hasn't happened yet, but if they can do it in Nariño, on the Pacific coast, they're going to be able to do it elsewhere.
And so this is when you confuse objectives. So
the objective. Let me just finish, Rob, and then just let me finish the last point to address the gentleman's question. I think the issue here is that the United States today, for the first time, and I am very happy about this, has a very ambivalent policy on this entire matter. Yes, President Obama and Secretary Clinton say that shared responsibility, but at the same time, and I'm very happy with this, President Obama instructs Attorney General Holder to say he will not apply the federal law forbidding the use of marijuana in those states who have approved the use of medical marijuana. He allows medical marijuana to be used in Veterans Administration's hospitals, unlike his predecessors. And he has not vetoed, and I don't think he will veto, the legalization ordinance that was approved in Washington, D.C., over which he has veto rights. So what I see, and what a lot of people see from abroad, is not a U.S. society and administration committed to fighting drug consumption in the United States, but rather the opposite. A U.S. society and administration more and more tolerant of the consumption or the use of some drugs, having a much more enlightened and open-minded attitude towards other drugs, and certainly not committed to a domestic war on drugs. You want a war on drugs, wage it here. Do it if you want to. But I'm not sure you really want to. You really want to have the kind of bloodshed that we have in Mexico? Do it.
Okay.
But I don't see you doing it.
Drop it at that because we're going to try and get some more questions in here. Rob, you have a quick response?
Well, basically, I think I've already covered the terrain that legalization of marijuana is not going to be a solution to bringing down the drug cartels. That's either going to be done or not done, but it isn't going to be because marijuana is legalized in the United States, whatever the merits or lack thereof of that argument are. The other point is, in Colombia, the objective wasn't to reduce hectares under cultivation. The objective was to destroy the Medellin and Cali cartels, which were a threat to the state, just as the Mexican cartels are a threat to the Mexican state, and the Colombians were phenomenally successful. And it wasn't military force. This was done in, I suffer from the fact that I actually was there working side by side with the Colombian leadership on this issue when I was the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration. So I suffer from either knowing something about it or the other way around. But in any event, so that was the objective, and in that objective they succeeded. And I've got to believe that that Mexico can succeed if it applies the same lessons.
Right here on the aisle, halfway back. Yes.
Hey, just want to clarify something. You said that there should, going forward, be a tacit understanding between the cartels and the Mexican government. It was my understanding that, especially during the Fox administration, that there was a tacit understanding that basically Fox said to the cartels, if the gringos want to take it, sell it, just don't bring it here to Mexico. So going forward, if Calderon makes a tacit agreement with the cartels, isn't that almost a surrender of the effort to finally destroy them? And when he came to power, didn't he realize the power of the cartels and did not want an Italian situation where the mafia accounts for 10% of GDP in Italy? What's the question?
On the case of Fox, what I can tell you is that I don't think there was a tacit understanding. I think basically he pursued the same policy which his 4 or 5 predecessors had pursued, which is essentially to ensure that you're containing the question, that you are not letting it get out of control, but that you are not going to war over something which is not of direct, immediate concern to Mexican society. And this is what I know as a fact, because I either remember it or lived through it. Díaz Ordaz, Echeverría, López Portillo, De la Madrid, Salinas, Cedillo, and Fox did. Now, maybe they were all wrong and or corrupt, and Calderon is right and or honest. But you're talking about a lot of very different people there. You're talking about technocrats, you're talking about Democrats, you're talking about populist demagogues, you're talking about sort of mediocre but decent people like De la Madrid. You're talking about all sorts of different folks there. They were all wrong. They all had it wrong, and Calderon has it right. I don't know, maybe. But, you know, you're not going to find a whole lot of people anymore in Mexico who subscribe to that view because the costs of this are so high and the benefits are so low for now. Then we go back to the discussion. One day the benefits will appear. Okay, when will that day be?
Another question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Sunil Paniketna. My question to both of you is, do you think it is the case that one way or the other, is the availability of firearms in the United States, is it a significant factor in the level and type of violence in Mexico, or is it the case that if firearms weren't as freely available in the United States, you know, they'd simply find other sources for finding the means?
Well, I think we have a responsibility as part of a broader strategy to work with the government of Mexico to reduce the availability of high-powered firearms into Mexico. And some of those, and quite a lot of them, are coming from the United States, and I've addressed that subject. I think it's true, if that's all you did, there are other sources from which you can get AK-47s and grenades, probably most of which are coming into Central America and across Mexico's southern border. So it's not, shall we say, it's not the panacea, but it is part of an overall strategy, should be thinking about, from an intelligence point of view, how you can disrupt the traffic in weapons into Mexico. And then, by the way, there's a lot that can be done. That's why military can't do it. It really has to be law enforcement and intelligence through development of confidential informants and the like as to where the armories are in Mexico. And some of them have been identified, and the Mexican government has been able to go in and seize a huge amount of weapons. But that's part of an overall strategy to what? Weaken the drug cartels to a point that you then can demolish their organization, remove their leaders and potential successors to that would be otherwise capable of running these multinational, multi-billion-dollar, in revenue anyway, organizations.
About 8 rows back in the middle there. Yes, hand is up.
Hi, Richard Wright from Fletcher and the Columbia Law School. Let's take as a given that we solve the problem in Mexico. I'm curious if either of you have any suggested strategies for then preventing the flood of drug money from the U.S. from causing a similar problem to pop up in Peru and Bolivia or elsewhere in Central America, just as it moved from Colombia to Mexico in the 90s.
Jorge.
Well, I think this is a real issue. I mean, even I've been in favor of the idea of sealing off the southern border. When I was in office, contributed to it as much as I could. I think Calderon had the right idea. But of course, if you're successful in sealing off the southern border in Mexico, which is probably the most effective single way you can have to stop cocaine from entering Mexico, not the U.S., but at least Mexico, then the problem is what happens in Central America. Santos last week said very clearly that he thought that part of his success, or Colombia's success, in somewhat limiting, I would say not even decreasing, but limiting production of cocaine has, one, spread it back to Peru. Peru, according to some statistics now, is producing more cocaine than Colombia is, again, like in your time, because the Peruvian government has decided that when the U.S. cut back on aid to Peru for all of this, it was not going to fill the gap. So you have the Peruvian question. Bolivia is a little bit less the case, but it's still important. Peru is a big deal, and Central America is a big deal because everything that Rob says about Mexico, which is true in spades about Central America. In other words, there you really have weak institutions. There you really don't have an army, police, a judicial system. You don't have really any of the things that Mexico has sort of, or that Colombia has sort of. And so it's a real issue. That's why I continue to think it's a better idea to stop following a policy which has proven to be failed and to start looking for alternatives. Just today, Cedillo, Cardoso, and Gaviria again endorsed the Vienna Declaration from 3 weeks ago or a month ago regarding legalization, et cetera, going well beyond what they had already done, what was it now, a year ago with the report from the UN Commission that they signed. These are three pretty responsible guys. Gaviria was a guy you used to deal with a great deal. He was a very effective, committed president of Colombia. Cardoso was there for 8 years, partly responsible for the current Brazilian miracle. Cedillo was an honest cop. He's the guy who first appointed a anti-drug czar, who turned out to be a drug czar. Threw him in jail very effectively, very decently.
Rebolo.
Rob, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the point would be, if you look at the destabilization that's going on right now, and I know this is something the U.S. is concerned about, I believe Mexico is as well, in Guatemala and other parts of Central America, including South America, these are operational extensions of the Mexican cartels in these countries. They're operating there, just as they have, by the way, a fair number of operatives in many cities across the United States. So this is the thing, I think, one of the reasons, at least more broadly, that there should be concerns that go beyond Mexico in terms of the Mexican drug cartels. Because while they're based or headquartered in Mexico, they're operating in many countries of the world, and they will have and are having a destabilizing effect in Central America, and potentially in their sources of supply countries like Peru and elsewhere.
One last question, and I'm going to have to... Yes, ma'am, right there.
I guess my question is more to Jorge. You mentioned a couple of questions ago that cleaning from corruption the judiciary system does not work, that presidents beforehand have tried it and it just regrows in there. So how can we expect that something like legalization could diminish even part of the crime that is developing around it? At least destabilization opens the doors to try through somewhere to debilitate it, whereas legalizing it only seems to give it more strength.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure I said exactly that. I think the point I tried to make was that previous presidents have thrown kingpins in jail. Previous presidents have declared a war on drugs. Previous presidents have cooperated closely with the United States, some more than others. Previous presidents have dissolved the Mexican police forces, different sectors of the Mexican police forces, and none of that led to any weakening of the cartels or of drug trafficking in Mexico in general. I do think that Mexico today, as a democratic country, has a less corrupt government, judicial system, etc., than before. I certainly do believe so. And I also think that legalization would help in many ways because you stop you start removing illegal activities from the illegal domain. And so you don't have to pursue them the way you do now. And so you don't have the problem of what do you do. You know how many people President Calderon has arrested, according to the numbers that are often quoted? He has arrested more than 75,000 people during his term. The Mexican prison population, according to the president himself, was 220,000 when he entered office, and it is 220,000 today. So one of two things. He freed 75,000 and replaced them with the new 75,000, or, as he himself has said, he had to let the new 75,000 go. Why? Because there's no case against them. Because the prosecution cannot prosecute them, because the judges will not try them, because in many cases they cannot prove that they are guilty. This is what has happened under Calderon. Forget what happened before. 75% of the people who are arrested on drug charges in Mexico are let go over the following 72 hours because the government does not have evidence to jail them. Is it the laws? Is it the Justice Department? Is it the judges? What is it? Or maybe it's we have laws that can't be enforced. I think in the United States, if I'm not mistaken, every time I walk in the streets of New York, I have that impression. You have some laws in the U.S. that can't be enforced either. For example, your immigration laws. My impression is, I may be wrong, but I've seen a lot of Mexicans in the streets of New York, a lot of Poblanos, and my impression is that they don't all have green cards. So you have laws that you can't enforce. What do most of you think should be done with U.S. immigration laws that you can't enforce? Should you change reality, or should you change the law? I think most of you would agree that you should change the law. If we took a poll here who's in favor of comprehensive immigration reform, I think we would have an overwhelming majority in favor. Well, I think you would be. Yeah. So maybe think about this in Mexico, too.
The immigration laws and enforcement, I mean, that's probably more of a policy choice, actually. But in any event, here's the thing. If you have a system in which drug traffickers are being arrested, but your system isn't capable of actually trying them and convicting them and incarcerating them, doesn't that lead you to think that one of the things you should be doing as a society and as a nation, and that is increasing the capacity and capability of your law enforcement and your judicial system to be able to do that, so that you will finally and at last in Mexico end the era of impunity?
I hope you all can join us for a reception upstairs, but first help me thank our very informed...
Marijuana was not born illegal.
Thank you for watching this Council on Foreign Relations video. For additional audio, video, and transcripts of CFR meetings, as well as expert analysis of international news, please visit us online at cfr.org.